When Donald Trump slapped tariffs on China, he thought he had the upper hand. But little did he know, China had a secret weapon ready to turn the tables, quietly reshaping the global economy. What Trump didn't see coming might just change everything you thought you knew about trade wars. The US-China trade war of the late 2000s made headlines worldwide. American farmers saw their exports blocked. Tech companies faced skyrocketing costs. Trump's tariffs were meant to punish China and force them to renegotiate. But behind the scenes, China had a plan, a strategy that didn't rely on confrontation, but on something far more subtle and powerful. To understand China's secret weapon, we first need to understand the battlefield. Trump's tariffs targeted over $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, ranging from steel to electronics. The goal? Protect American jobs, punish unfair trade practices, and bring manufacturing back to the US. But tariffs are a blunt instrument. They work in theory, but in practice, they're like trying to hit a moving target. China's economy is not just massive, it's adaptive, innovative, and interconnected with global supply chains in ways most people don't realize. So when the US increased tariffs, China didn't panic. They didn't retaliate with chaos. Instead, they did something smarter. Something almost invisible, but devastatingly effective. Many people assumed China's secret weapon would be their currency, devalue the yuan, make American goods more expensive, retaliate economically, but that's not what happened. In fact, China kept their currency relatively stable, avoiding the chaos that could hurt their own economy. No, the real weapon was something more strategic, something that exploited the very structure of global trade itself. And it wasn't even a new tactic. It had been quietly developed for years. China's true secret weapon was the supply chain. Global supply chains are the lifeblood of modern manufacturing. Most products, smartphones, cars, electronics, are not made in one country. Components are manufactured in multiple countries, assembled somewhere else, then shipped worldwide. And China had spent decades mastering this network. When tariffs hit, China didn't just absorb them, they rewired the system. Companies started relocating parts of their production to neighboring countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Why? Because Trump's tariffs were specifically targeting Chinese exports. By moving manufacturing just outside China's borders, the same products could bypass tariffs entirely. This is not a minor tweak. Analysts estimate that over $50 billion in exports effectively avoided tariffs thanks to these subtle shifts. The US was hitting the wrong target, and China quietly smiled. But it wasn't just supply chains. China had another ace up its sleeve: technology. The country invested heavily in domestic innovation, ensuring they could produce high-tech components without relying on US imports. Take semiconductors, for example. The Trump administration tried to block Chinese companies from buying critical American chips, but China accelerated its domestic chip production programs, pouring billions into R&D and forming alliances with other Asian countries. By the time the restrictions took effect, China was less dependent on US technology than anyone expected. In other words, while the US thought it was strangling China, China was quietly building resilience. Trump's approach was aggressive, immediate, and headline-grabbing. China's approach was slow, deliberate, and almost invisible. They understood that economic battles aren't won overnight. They're won over years. Instead of responding with anger, China leveraged time as a weapon. They stabilized their markets, strengthened domestic consumption, and diversified their trade partners. Meanwhile, US companies faced uncertainty. Stock prices fluctuated and public frustration grew. China's secret weapon wasn't one single tool. It was a combination: supply chain strategy, domestic innovation, and patience. It's a textbook case of turning a disadvantage into an opportunity. The effects weren't just bilateral. This strategy reshaped global trade. Countries across Asia benefited as production shifted away from China to avoid tariffs. Emerging economies became new manufacturing hubs. Supply chains became more complex, resilient, and diversified. And multinational companies adapted, often in ways that hurt U.S. leverage. In short, the U.S. thought it was waging a trade war against China, but in reality, it was waging a war against a global system that China had helped build and now knew how to manipulate better than anyone else. So what does this teach us? First, trade wars are rarely simple. Tariffs may look tough, but they are blunt instruments against highly adaptive opponents. Second, economic resilience comes from preparation, diversification, and long-term strategy, not just reactionary measures. China's secret weapon wasn't money, guns, or propaganda. It was intelligence, patience, and the mastery of a system most countries take for granted. They showed the world that in the modern economy, power isn't just about wealth. It's about control over networks, information, and innovation. And while Trump's tariffs made headlines, the quiet reshaping of global trade may have a far greater impact than anyone realizes, an impact that could define the next decade of economic power. So next time you hear about trade wars, tariffs, and headline-grabbing economic battles, remember this: the real fight is rarely obvious. The real weapons are patience, strategy, and the quiet, unseen forces that move behind the headlines. China's secret weapon didn't just counter Trump's tariffs. It reminded the world that in the battle for economic supremacy, the most powerful moves are often invisible. But there's more to the story than just economics. China's moves weren't only about dodging tariffs, they were also geopolitical chess. By strengthening relationships with other countries, China created alternatives to US-centric trade networks. For example, initiatives like the Belt and Road were quietly accelerating, opening new markets for Chinese goods while increasing influence in Africa, Europe, and South Asia. Meanwhile, the US, focused on bilateral confrontation, struggled to build similarly compelling trade partnerships. What looks like an economic victory in Washington can actually result in long-term strategic setbacks when global influence shifts elsewhere. Another layer often overlooked is the human factor. While US tariffs caused real pain for American farmers and manufacturers, China invested in protecting its workforce and retraining talent for emerging industries. They focused on education, tech skills, and innovation hubs. By the time the tariffs hit full force, the labor force was already pivoting to sectors less vulnerable to foreign pressure. This wasn't luck. It was deliberate long-term planning, aligning human capital with economic strategy. In essence, China treated the trade war as a test of national resilience and passed it with flying colors. For the United States, the lesson is stark. Tariffs alone cannot guarantee success. Without strategic foresight, policy can create unintended consequences. While it's easy to blame China for exploiting loopholes, the reality is that global trade is complex, interconnected, and adaptive. Whoever masters the networks, talent, and innovation pipelines wields real power. The next trade battles will not just be fought in the boardrooms or on Wall Street. They'll be fought in supply chains, technology labs, and strategic partnerships around the world. And China's playbook gives us a glimpse of what modern economic warfare really looks like. Trump may have tried to hit China where it hurt, But China's response showed that the greatest power lies not in retaliation, but in resilience. The quiet moves, the unseen strategies, the patient planning, these are the weapons that shape the future. The trade war may have made headlines, but the real story was written in the invisible threads of the global economy. So next time someone talks about tariffs as a magic solution, remember this: the real battles are not fought with confrontation, but with cunning, patience, and vision. And in that fight, China may have just set a blueprint the world will be studying for decades.